Welcome back to Trending in Education. Mike Palmer, Brandon Jones, and myself, Dan Strafford. And today we have some hot takes on a cold show. It's winter is coming. Game of Thrones is coming your way. We're going to talk about not only the show itself, but about education around Game of Thrones as well. As always, like to check in first. Brandon, how you doing?
I'm doing even better after that open, Dan. I don't know how long you've been sitting on that, but the hot eats, cool treats, the Dairy Queen style. I like it.
There it is.
I'm doing real well. I love Game of Thrones. I love learning. I'm excited. I've been in my not full series re-binge, but I've watched season 6 and season 7.
Oh.
So I'm ready. I'm ready for this. I'm ready for that. I'm ready for this and that. I'm doing well.
Little bit of this, little bit of that. Mike, are you ready to hang with Brandon and myself talking Game of Thrones?
I'm just gonna keep saying, yeah, man. I'm well, I don't know if you guys know this about me, but I was born ready. So I happen to be ready for this. But I mean, my goodness. And just to clarify for our listeners, first off, thanks for joining. And then secondly, today's show's more about what can be learned from Game of Thrones.
True.
So this is, we talk about the edifying edutainment, one of the topics, one of the hot items in our tasty tournament, March Madness, which is happening right now. So there's a lot to be learned from edutainment and Game of Thrones. If you haven't heard, you better ask somebody because it's entertaining and it's relevant, and there's a ton to be learned.
Absolutely.
That's not the whole story, though, Dan. I know. I'll give you one moment.
But there's more.
There's slightly more. We are also going to come back with our final season of the Citadel, where we'll be breaking down each episode of Game of Thrones when they actually begin. So starting right after the first episode of season 8. On April 14th. So right about, April 15th, right around the tax day, it's time to get your Game of Thrones on. So we'll hit all that action. I'm excited.
There it is. And we will talk a bit about the Citadel, the place on this episode, place of learning in the show. For those of you who haven't watched and plan to, there will be spoilers of sorts as we go through here. So you can listen. We're not going to give away drastic plot lines, but there will be references to the show and things that may come to pass as we talk through. So this is your warning, as Brandon, I think, has said, Mike's in the past, or lest you be spoilt. It will happen here on this show. So,
Dan, I thought you were going to say this episode is short and full of spoilers. I thought that was what.
There's a good one too. But there's so many callbacks. It's been 2 years now.
Right.
Where do you want to start, Mike? Like there are the specific articles we shared around educational purposes from the show. There's a grad course based on Game of Thrones and leadership tactics therein. There's been a scientific study on who should be left at the end of this season. But what do you think is the most interesting, or where do you want to jump off in this discussion around Game of Thrones and education?
Yeah. First place, Brandon walked in on me prepping a little bit earlier. You got to call back to the Prince, right? And Machiavelli's Prince, that is. So I think political science is probably the most straight ahead learning angle for the Game of Thrones. So it's all about realpolitik. It's all about Machiavellianism. And it's the idea that frequently good politics involves things that may not always be viewed as moral or ethical. And I think that's zeitgeisty on a number of fronts. And if I were teaching like an intro political science program, I'd probably be referencing a little bit of Game of Thrones when I talk about Machiavelli's The Prince. And I also think, it's probably most useful for people who are trying to understand how to be an effective policymaker, an effective political candidate, to bone up on their Game of Thrones. I don't know what you think. That was my opening salvo, Brandon. I don't know if you have any takes on my take.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. You could also reference the Prince when teaching Game of Thrones, because there's now a Game of Thrones in the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
So as Dan was saying, at Columbia Business School, there is now a Game of Thrones leadership through Game of Thrones lessons class, which I think is probably really interesting. It feels a little opportunistic, right? So, and also,
Wait,
I think
how do you mean? How do you mean exactly? I'm not following you, Brandon. Can you go into more detail on this?
Yeah. You're just being funny, Dan. You have to give me, like, you have to spoil me when you're trying to be funny, so like I can react appropriately. So, and the professor, I think it's the same professor, Bruce Craven, who I'll admit, like, when I was reading this article the first time, I thought that we were talking about Wes Craven, since he's the Craven I know.
Right.
Does he go by the three-eyed Craven, do you think?
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
The Game of Thrones reference.
That's right. There you go.
Yeah.
Spoiler alert.
Yeah.
They got birds with extra eyes. He's written a book.
I saw that.
Also, leadership. What's it called? Leadership through Game of Thrones. Leadership lessons from Game of Thrones. I'll get it right here. Hold please. Leadership secrets from Game of Thrones. So, yeah, I think it's interesting. I like the Machiavelli piece, and I do think that in teaching, one of the things we talked about is, how to find hooks that already exist and hang new knowledge onto those. And I think my guess is that those entertainment hooks of things like Game of Thrones are pretty securely affixed to your brain structures. And so, using those as a teaching mechanism, I think is really smart. So I like the Machiavelli angle. I do think on the having it explicitly as a course or as a book that you sort of draw from this world, it feels a little, it feels a little something to me.
A little gimmicky, maybe?
Gimmicky. I think
Are they maybe engaging in some gimmickry?
I think it may be gimmickry in that classroom, but far from me to cast any aspersions. Like, if it's working, then great. And I think that is a credit to the world that George R. R. Martin created. Is it's so rich and so deep that like someone can not as on a lark can actually create graduate level coursework from it.
Right. Although interestingly, like getting back to the edifying edutainment, I think frequently the knock on bringing in those relevant pop culture entertainment references to your classroom is that it's sort of gimmicky. It's like you're adding too much cognitive load, because people, instead of actually understanding what they need to know about political science or business practices or whatever, instead they start thinking, oh yeah, that was pretty cool when Tyrion was on a dragon,
Right. But I think there's a little bit makes me think of sort of the moonwalking with Einstein. If you're building sort of, if in your memory palace you can find things that are, the imagery of them is really compelling to you. I think that's probably what we're trying to do here with this. I think that it does border in not super deft hands. I think it does border on gimmickry, but I think it can be, if it's done well, I think it can actually help secure that knowledge. My guess is that the goal of those seminars, et cetera, is actually to get people to encode and then be able to recall the things that they're being taught. So at a certain level, it either works better or it doesn't.
Right.
And I think if it works better, not that any ends justify any means, but I feel like that could be effective.
I see what you did there.
Yeah.
You got a callback to the Prince.
There you go.
But the interesting angle, I think, also is what exactly are we doing to just draw the learner in initially? Because it does feel a little bit like clickbait, where like the fact that we're talking about pretty much every article we're going to share out as part of this show, except for maybe a Wikipedia reference to Machiavelli, is going to be clickbait. And that's because right now, more from more on the economics and advertising angle on it, anything that talks about Game of Thrones is going to draw some attention. So, I guess attention as a commodity a little gimmickry to draw the right attention to start the conversation is good. I think the question is how much depth, how much meat can you actually put on the bone?
Right.
And I don't really know, because I've only done the surface investigation of these. I haven't read that guy's book. We're not going to talk to any of the authors of these articles, as far as I can tell. But it definitely it captures attention. Like for those of you who are listening to this, many of you may be listening to this because we're talking about Game of Thrones,
right?
And hopefully you're entertained.
Yeah, that's right. The thing on the gimmickry piece, and I think clickbait is another good example here. Journalists will write headlines with an attempt to hook, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like there is a line, and I think it's not that fine. I think you actually can tell what's on one side or the other between what is clickbait and what is, effective hooks to draw attention.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a similar, I think there's probably a spectrum similarly for, using edutainment for instructional purposes.
Mm-hmm.
Is what is just clickbaity, or like what's the instructional version of clickbait?
Right.
Chalkbait. Like what is something that is just confectionery for the learner, and like what is actually an effective hook?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's an interesting consideration for instructors as well.
Yeah, and I think also understanding your audience, right? So like Game of Thrones is not for your traditional K-12 crowd, right? So
I hope not. I think it's like more K-5. I think is probably the target demo.
There are some adult themes.
There are
within Game of Thrones,
a few,
and I think that's a big part of it. That's part of why. Getting back to your Moonwalking with Einstein mnemonics episode that we talked about, cognitive hacks, memory palaces frequently involve creating images and putting them in a physical location, and associating memories with that so you can remember things better. But one of the interesting things is that the more salacious the image, the more ribald, or I'll be okay, debauched, or whichever, the more racy it is, the more vivid the imagery, the more likely you remember it. Game of Thrones is extremely memorable in that respect, where like there's all these really like lush, sort of over the top, and lush in another dimension.
I drink and I know things.
Yes, and it's like it's almost hitting your reptile brain in a way that a lot of other programming doesn't. It's not TV, it's HBO, and it's sort of waking you up in a way that traditional television wouldn't. I think that's an interesting idea for education, but obviously it's only for an adult audience. So like, and actually we may be losing our audience who's like, Game of Thrones, not my cup of tea. So apologies. We're still talking about learning, so please stay.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we've already lost the people we're going to lose. And so now we run the risk of losing the people we might have kept just by talking about how we're losing people. So
let's stop.
Yeah.
Well, I think as you develop the idea around the Columbia course specifically, that it's in line with Columbia's management style and their courses. So it's written specifically by Craven to be part of that world, to be on that same plane. So it is an intriguing one to understand there. But Mike, as we sort of turn the page and understand better exactly how people are using the show in the classroom or maybe via text, do you think that it's been part of the social conscious that it's expressed to everyone, meaning that like even someone who doesn't watch the show can at least get something out of it or understand where they're supposed to be heading?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it's very much part of the zeitgeist, as we try to say zeitgeist every show.
Yeah, zeitgeisty.
So it's definitely part of the it's zeitgeisty. I do think it's relevant in that as much as anything that's part of the mass culture is relevant, and like sort of being able to stay current with what's happening in the world around you makes you more interesting, more cool, more relevant in a conversation. So I do think there's an element to that as well, where like people, even who don't keep up with Game of Thrones, probably have some passing knowledge. They've probably seen it for moments at a time. So I think there's an element of connecting it to the world outside of the classroom that we've talked about a bunch. And I think generally that is a way to connect with your audience. I also think it's an interesting example. I'm thinking about this when we do launch the Citadel this season. My angle might be to always have like hot learning takes on the most recent episode.
Hot learning pies.
All those things.
Yeah.
Because like it is what I think we do in an interesting way at times on the show is like we try to sort of almost work in reverse. It's almost like a parlor game where it's like, there ain't no way you're going to connect learning to Game of Thrones. And we're like, challenge accepted.
Right.
So it is interesting to think about it that way, where like, if you think about the storytelling and narrative and relevance aspects of good instructional design, I think there's a lot to chew on in Game of Thrones, especially for those of us who really love the show or the books. So like there's a way to kind of signal, what you're passionate about. And then I got to imagine reading all these books as a teenager is probably not good for you. I don't know what you guys think.
Yeah, I think not good for you. I mean, it's like, I don't know, in the 5 books, we'll see if Winds of Winter ever hits the shelves or digital shelves, but it's probably like 4,000, 3,500 pages, something like that. So I think generally when you read 4,000 pages, that's probably not good for you.
Right.
Even if the content is a little ribald. I mean, I think for the right audience, not right for an 8-year-old, but for whatever, an 18-year-old, I think certainly the content is appropriate, and especially in the written form and net positive.
Yeah.
I think just also on the Game of Thrones, to the question that Dan asked, there are Game of Thrones watchers and non-watchers, and we want to be diverse and inclusive in this podcast. And if you are not a non-Game of Thrones listener who has not yet bagged this podcast episode, I think there's actually something that's learned. Even if you're completely uninterested in the content, I think that the cultural phenomenon that is Game of Thrones is actually really interesting, whomever you are, right? Because thinking about how something goes viral, thinking about how something becomes part of the zeitgeist, becomes part of the social milieu, I think is interesting, whether you are a content creator, whether you're a consumer of content, whether you're a critic of content, whether you're just like a person in the world. I suppose you're one of those or more of those things, no matter who you are, depending on how you define content. We all consume some content. I think that's there's an interesting cultural piece to it too. So even if you're not watching, you're part of the phenomenon in as much as it exists around you, whether or not through you.
Right. And I also think like it's about to end.
Sure
which is interesting on a number of.
I'm going to pour some Arbor Gold out for that. Like that is sad news.
It is sad news, but like with its passing, I've heard folks talk about the end of appointment television as well. Because like if you think about Netflix and you think about the way Stranger Things season 3 is about to come out, that whole season is going to get dropped on Netflix, and many folks are just going to set aside a weekend and power through it. And that's a very different viewing experience than what you get with Game of Thrones. And then Game of Thrones is probably the closest version of modern golden age of television programming that is reminiscent of sports to me. Because like part of why I watch live sports is because I never know what might happen.
Right.
And then Game of Thrones, absolutely why you watch Game of Thrones, because you never know. Like the character, the whole narrative's been built around for an entire season may suddenly be gone. And like, talk about like learning something relevant nowadays, learn about storytelling and like building to a crescendo, and then the power of surprise. Ton to learn there. And not to mention the ripple effect into social media that we're trying to surf right now.
Surf those ripples.
Yeah, man.
Yeah.
And I think, Mike, you shared an article just before we started recording here about a study that went about trying to figure out the physical way that Game of Thrones may end, and had some really interesting thoughts to it around the different characters and their appearances on screen, how they passed away, whether it be natural causes or because of a physical altercation. There's a lot of data going into Game of Thrones, not just coming out of it.
Totally. And like the internet prediction economy is kind of losing its mind right now, because there's so many different ways in which this type of information can roll out. But it's kind of wild how many prediction economies, prediction markets, machine learning. We did a show on predicting the World Cup.
Absolutely.
Where we were talking about the difference between random forest distributions, new artificial intelligence, machine learning predictions versus intelligent squid.
Intelligent squid, yeah.
And the like. But any of the ways in which folks are forecasting who's going to win the Game of Thrones, or who's going to expire on the Game of Thrones catch your interest?
Well, so yes, and I want to hit a couple more beats on that Smithsonian
Sure.
.com
Yes.
article that you had sent. So interesting. So if I could just call out a couple things. So this was a catalog of all of the characters and who has died and how they died.
Yes.
So they have listed 330 important, it's in quotes, characters.
Right. These are, just to be clear, these are epidemiologists.
These are epidemiologists from Australia
who study mortality rates and other diseases and such.
Yeah.
And then they're using their practices based on the plot lines of Game of Thrones.
That's right. In fact, they when they did classify them, they used this alphanumeric death code based on the International Statistical Classification of Diseases and Related Health Problems. So they used something from industry to apply it to this. I couldn't like this more. I'm trying to like this more, and it's just impossible because I like it the most.
Maxed out.
Through this analysis, and if you haven't seen Game of Thrones, like spoiler alert, just as a general part of the oeuvre here, that a lot of people die.
Yeah.
So 56.4% of the people have died.
Wow.
That 73.7% of those are caused by injuries.
Yeah.
They've only shown 2 natural deaths depicted in the show.
I was trying to remember them.
Yeah.
But I couldn't.
I think Maester Aemon.
Yes.
He passes peacefully in the night.
Right. Maybe like the old dude in the Night's Watch.
That's the dude.
Oh, like you said.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that the natural passings often involve old dudes in the night.
That's probably true.
But that was also interesting. So they classified them as either highborn or lowborn, and then their occupation. I like this.
Oh my God.
Silk collar jobs and boiled leather collar jobs. So good. So they use this. That this is the whole point of the show here is that this space, that world that George R. R. Martin has created is interesting enough that you can apply something like epidemiology to this space. And one, it's fun.
Mm-hmm.
2, it gets people talking about friggin' epidemiology, right? So like if you're an epidemiologist, you know what you want people talking about, is your work, right? So I think it's great.
Yeah, and I mean, I'll talk Ebola as much as the next guy.
Yeah,
but like this is a more entertaining way to learn. Like if you're just learning epidemiology for the first time and you happen to be a Game of Thrones stir, this is going to resonate even more.
Yeah. So it was interesting. And we're basically just reading this article, or I am to y'all. You can check it out as well. But just their insights from the data. These are all based on the data. The N is pretty big here. A lot of people die. Is that highborn people who switch alliances or switch houses or whatever, go from a house to the Night's Watch, etc., are the most likely to survive.
Yeah, and even more so the ladies.
And more so the ladies. That's right. So they peg then Sansa and Arya Stark as the 2 most likely to survive based on that.
And then not too far behind them are Jon Snow
and Bran
and Tyrion too,
and
right?
Tyrion.
Yeah, those 3. And then the one, it didn't look good for Daenerys though, based on this analysis.
Although she is highborn, but she has not swithed houses. She's a highborn woman, so she's got 2 of the factors.
Just switch a house.
Her risk factors are low. Like she's not a smoker. She's doesn't have a history of heart disease. So I thought that was interesting, and then maybe if I can just take us to one additional one. There's the odds on this.
Oh my God,
the odds making. They're there are places where you can place bets.
Yep. Correct.
like legitimate houses of bet making.
Yes.
Where you can bet on this. There's odds to survive the season.
Right.
Or I guess there's the odds that they will be the first character who doesn't survive the season.
Right.
There are odds who will rule at the end of season 8.
Right.
There's like all these, basically in all these different spaces, whether it's in the classroom or in the, at your sports book, like there's places to get Game of Thrones action. Which I think is pretty cool.
And I think the real interesting action though, because if you play the Game of Thrones, you either win or you die.
That's right.
And
or you have a third alternative that doesn't scan as well.
Exactly. But if you talk about who wins, I think that's probably the most interesting action. I mean, the sharps, the people who got the angles, you could probably make some clever bets and win a little bit on the sides. But the thing that people are going to get excited about, I think, are saying who is going to be sitting on the Iron Throne at the end of season 8. And there's some interesting
I was going to say,
interesting action there. Yeah, Dan, what you got?
Well, there's just a wide range, and I think one is no one, too. I think one is there's one that's the field, meaning everyone that wasn't mentioned as a specific player, and then I believe they also have that no one is, that it all just blows up and the world ends at the end of the final season. There's also Game of Thrones fantasy opportunity where you can draft different houses and follow it that way and get points for certain actions, certain battles. But they're trying it. And I think that's the interesting thing that I was trying to get into with the science study is it's sort of leaning into Game of Thrones and using it to teach, but also pulling out from Game of Thrones things that we can study and learn and get involved in that environment. I think, Mike, you made... What was that?
Go ahead, please.
You made the point about Tolkien, and I'm a big Lord of the Rings person. I actually took a course in college, speaking of the one at Columbia, called Philosophy and Man, that was based solely off of the Lord of the Rings trilogy.
Right.
And so it was an interesting idea to see this here as well. I took a lot out of that course more than the books and the analogies and the metaphors we were able to pull together from the world created. And whether or not George R.R. Martin finishes the final book and finishes the story, HBO clearly is in some way, shape, or form. So we're getting this sort of closed-in world, and you hear the phrase art imitating life or life imitating art. There's a lot of things in this show that just resonate with people and resonate with the way we interact. And I think even the odds here, you have the people you're rooting for. You have the people that you expect to be there. And you make the joke about the sharps. Maybe they take the heart and the bias out of it and make the choices they want to make. But it's just been such an experience that I think speaks to a lot of people. I did want to ask Mike one question of you, and Brandon, feel free to chime in here about the Maesters and about the Citadel itself and about the books of learning. And we spent pretty much the entire season with Sam and Gilly there in the Citadel studying the books. Is it your belief, Mike, and Brandon, you too, that all of the history of Westeros is available to us there in the Citadel, and thus the story's already been written? That's a theory I've seen and sort of talks to the entirety of the history here, and history as a subject and history as a teaching moment. Do you think it's all there, or do you think this is still being written as we're watching it?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but I have heard folks say that basically Sam is the writer and that, he's sort of documenting the history of Westeros, and that ultimately what we're reading is written by him or from his perspective.
Right.
I think that Brandon is more of our genuine maester when it comes to understanding the intricacies of Westeros and Game of Thrones. But I think one thing that you got me thinking about here, Dan, and the epidemiologists, nice band name, by the way, Dan and the epidemiologists, but is that using works like Game of Thrones or like Lord of the Rings as a data set, and then using that data set to try to figure out where the story is going. I think it's an interesting idea, because I think there's a point at which you might start to get inside our George R.R. Martin's mind. But then I also think, unlike the data sets that you typically draw from, he's trying to surprise you. So like, I don't know if it would actually work. But it is interesting if you think about world building and, Tolkien, I was talking about more as it relates to Duolingo's courses on High Valyrian and Dothraki. Tolkien famously, invented Elvish and Orcish and a bunch of other languages, and he was a philologist. Like he was a professional studier of language, Brandon, I will defer to you. I think you are like chief Westeros maester here. So
I've consumed a lot of Westerosian content. So
yes.
I'll gladly wear the chain. To Dan's question, I mean, there's probably history that happened that went unrecorded. So, in both like times like the Children of the Forest, before the First Men, like I'm not sure how much, like what a written tradition they had. And then I think the thing that the show has done so well is capture all the quiet moments between just humans. And, presumably a lot of that goes unrecorded. And in fact, that's like some of the most important thing that happens, the reveal of, this is super spoiler because R plus L equals J, like the reveal of John's lineage and his given name. Like that is in a quiet moment that in fact actually went unrecorded except by the three-eyed raven.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the interesting story is about Sam as the writer of what we're watching now. He has the moment where in the Citadel in season 6, I think there's an exchange, maybe it's 7, exchange with the maester there, the archmaester, who has he's writing a book with like a pretty non-poetic title, and Sam is like giving him guff about his the lack of poetry in the title, and A Song of Ice and Fire is pretty poetic. So I think that speaks well. I thought it was also interesting, just a couple other things just to riff on here. There's a theory that if Sam, because everybody believes this, so like Sam is not on a lot of boards that you can, you can't find action on him to bet that he will be among the first to die. There's a counter theory, which is that it will be his child, who is named also Sam Tarly, named after him. And they make a big deal about how he and Gilly are teaching this child to read. And I think, obviously George R. R. Martin is a writer, and he is a learned man. He fills his book with books and dusty tomes and ravens carrying messages. But there is a lot of attention paid to like teaching people to read, and how that, there's with Davos, his learning to read being taught by Shireen, that saves his life when he sees a raven scroll. The Gilly being taught to read, actually being the one who learns about the annulment. I think there's definitely a nod to education as as an empowering force in the show, that on our show about education and Game of Thrones, I think is really appropriate to call out.
I think that's great. And I hadn't even thought of it until now, but now all that fan activity around the Night King actually being the iPhone. I hadn't actually made that. I just made that.
Yeah, it's good. I like that. I like that.
Yeah.
In the list, the who is going to end up on the throne, some deep cuts here. So the Hound at plus 12,000.
Wow.
These are odds as of March 20th.
Sure.
I think I can't believe anybody has inside action on that. I can't believe that isn't higher.
That's crazy.
So
why isn't he in the field?
Right, he should be in the field. Gilly at better odds than the Hound, actually. It seems unlikely.
Yeah.
The best odds are Bran Stark.
Yeah.
I guess the best odds are the field, right? So, but of the people who are not the field, or the best odds are no one, excuse me.
Right.
But the no one odds, the best odds are Bran Stark.
And this starts to tease a little more Citadel action, but like the big idea that's out there right now is that Bran is in fact the Night King.
Yeah, and that also Bran was the one who made the Mad King go mad, because he was telling him to burn them all, and he meant about the White Walkers. And that was like that didn't come through, and so he thought Aerys Targaryen thought that he was hearing vision, like having visions,
because Bran was still figuring out his brain teleportation,
his warging. Yeah. So I also so Bran basically is Westerosian Google.
Yes.
I mean, he's got the being able to commute, but like imagine having a source where you can go to and instantly find out anything.
Right.
He's like, it's like basically Google. It's like, ask Bran, like ask Siri. Like that's pretty good.
Yeah, I don't know what kind of revenue model he has, but otherwise he's right there.
It's definitely, there's paid search. Like there's definitely, depending on what you click on. Speaking of clickbait, Bran is going to serve up
goodness.
the most. Here's the best things to see from trip through Westerosian history.
So much to dive into. Any final thoughts? We're going to come back with after the first episode. So I want to give you both an opportunity before the season kicks off for any maybe not hot takes, but any expectations or things you want to learn this season. Brandon, maybe you first, things you're looking forward to most of all.
Yeah, so this is going to get a little bit into Citadel type content, but just to wrap us out. So the showrunners or George R. R. Martin, I'm not sure who this was attributed to, said the ending is going to be bittersweet. So I think that means that most people we have come to really like will die. So I'm obviously interested. You ask, what are we interested in seeing? I'm interested in seeing who remains. My hope is that it's hard. It's like, it's hard to end things, right? Like it happens too quick. I think as I mentioned, I rewatched season 7, like everyone was on fast travel. Like that was pretty unsettling for shows that had spent multiple episodes with people traveling by wagon, through the long road. So the King's Road or up to the Wall. So I guess I'm hoping that the resolution is not one that leaves us unsatisfied. I think bittersweet would actually be satisfying. Like if everything ended with a nice, happy bow tied on it, that probably wouldn't feel tonally consistent with the rest of the series. But I hope it doesn't feel cheap or gimmicky or rushed. And that's, I guess, the thing I'm most concerned about. But I love this world. There's going to be, I'm also interested, I guess, to see post this show how many spin-offs actually come out of it. There's already one that's in that's been signed. I think it actually may be in like pre-production now. So could it be 1 to 10? I like this is a very rich world and people are interested in it. As long as you can be making that money, I think HBO will be interested. So lots that I'm excited about. I've been looking forward to this for 2 years, and can't wait to actually have it arrive.
Yeah, and we'll talk about it on the Citadel. And it does remind me a little bit of The Walking Dead with sort of this world that they've created and trying to get the spinoffs going. I know Walking Dead has a couple of movies and some other shows. I'm sure Game of Thrones will be doing the same. Mike, how about yourself?
No, I when you said it's a rich world, I was about to say, you got that right, in that people are making a lot of money off of this. So, like, I imagine it's going to stick around. And, it won't be the same. So I do feel like this is really like a milestone moment. And I do think as a trend spotting show, we talked about Education 2020, like the world will look back on this year and think of it as a different time. And I do think part of that is going to be driven by, remember when Game of Thrones was at the height of its powers? Remember when that series ended? It's the way people look back on the last episode of MASH or Who Shot JR. And that in and of itself is starting to wind down. So like I would say, try to hold off on your own bittersweet nostalgia until afterwards and just lean into the experience.
Don't stop believing.
Don't stop believing. There you go, Sopranos. But yeah, I mean, I'm really excited it's finally back, because remember how into it we were 2 long years ago, and good news is we're still here and we're still covering it. So be on the lookout for the Citadel, and looking forward to digging in more.
And that's going to do it for this edition of Trending in Education. Thanks so much for listening. Plenty still to come, as Mike was just saying, around Game of Thrones. We will have a weekly Citadel episode recapping what happened and what we see moving forward. And we'll loop in education and learning wherever we can, of course. But next week on Tuesday, we have a brand new Trending in Education. We're going to look at our March Madness finals, and we're going to crown a winner. We look forward to that. We look forward to the extras that are coming your way as well. Follow us on Twitter at TrendingInEd. Of course, the same on Facebook, or find us at trendingineducation.com. Until next time, thanks so much for listening to Trending in Education.